Buen día a todos. Muchas gracias para la oportunidad. That's actually where my Spanish stops as far as fluency is concerned. So just a nice try. Really privileged to be with you today and to contribute to these discussions. What I'm going to try to do essentially through the presentation is to share with you some elements of the way regulators deal with issues related to balancing public health issues in the context of a risk management continuum where the most important instrument for a regulator generally is actually to use regulations. And I hope I will engage you in a discussion about how the choice of that instrument should be driven essentially by a science and a risk analysis system. And in that regard, I'm going to actually use to a certain extent an academic way now that I am an academic. So essentially going really through the introduction of the requirements of a robust food regulatory system. I'm sure that actually a lot of it is known to you, but I think it's nice to start with almost basic principles and then build upon those. I will attempt after that to share some elements of experience that I had when I had the privilege to serve as a regulator for Health Canada for the last 13 years. And I have chosen essentially the issue of managing trans fatty acids in food and the way we manage that in Canada. And hopefully actually that will get us into a discussion subsequently in the afternoon, or hopefully it will fuel the discussions in the afternoon. Now starting of course with the principles about the importance of partnership in food safety. Food safety regulatory systems, food safety and nutrition regulatory systems are a shared responsibility. And the way the system behaves is really as strong as the responsibility of the partners there. Obviously, the primary responsibility goes to industry, because again, industry is responsible for producing foods that are safe, that have the information, that has the information needed for consumers. Consumers also have an important responsibility as well, and that is essentially in handling foods in a manner that will not make them sick, or essentially even in choosing food that are suitable to their conditions. Not every food is suitable for every consumer or every family when we speak about food allergies, food intolerances, for example, amongst other things. And I always list governments at the end because generally governments should technically have the least type of intervention there. And they still do have a role essentially in creating the framework for these two partners generally to interact in a harmonious way. Now, I always, when I try to represent a food safety and nutrition regulatory system, I always think of a house. It's always, simple to think of a house and represent that. The foundation of the house is generally your legislative and regulatory framework. Usually, that's essentially where you build, things upon, and you need to start with a robust legislation to begin with. What essentially makes the house hold together, the pillars, is essentially following principles, and those principles come to us thankfully from an international guidance that we received, and that's essentially the risk analysis principles that we mostly rely upon, particularly those who adhere to the Codex Alimentarius Commission guidance. And finally, the roof that keeps the house together is the fact that all the different partners and stakeholders are acting together in a responsible way. And I cannot emphasize enough on this part, and we will discuss this later on during the talk. Now, starting with that foundation piece. A robust legislation, what does a legislation do in general? A legislation really creates order in the system, generally defines the roles and the responsibility, who is responsible for what, defines the governance, and of course these things can be different depending on the country, depending on the constitution, depending on the culture. So all these has a variety, but those principles of what it does are generally the same. It also establishes the foundation of the control system, and amongst other things, for example, establishes the consequences for not conforming to the requirements of safety, whether be it food safety or nutrition. Now, generally, that's actually what it contains, but generally, in order for a legislation to be effective, and particularly a legislation giving authorities to create regulation, there are a number of requirements that actually sound regulators attempt to apply. And this is essentially not on the what side, but on the how the business of regulators is conducted. Generally, again, and rarely will you see a regulator relying on one option, one instrument to manage the risk. So it is very general to see that you have a mix of tools that you need to rely upon if you are to be effective in addressing an issue. And again, to remember that regulation is not the magic wand by which you address everything. It is but one instrument in a mix of risk management instruments that are available for regulators and partners in the food safety and nutrition system to manage an issue. When regulations are used, it is very important that they are commensurate to the health risk. It is very important that they are based on evidence, and it is very important that they are consistent. Why consistency? Because otherwise you will have arbitrary decisions and you will lose trust in the way the food regulatory system functions. Continuing on the how and some of these best practices, again, the system will not function effectively unless you have the involvement and the participation of the various partners. And unless there is transparency, information is shared and is made available in order to create and foster trust. And there is also the importance to strive towards assessing the potential impacts of any regulatory mechanism that is being contemplated. And that should happen, in fact, at the beginning of the process, you know, before essentially implementing the regulatory decision. That is an element that is part of a regulatory policy development piece. Now, of course, all these are really not but are nothing else but corollaries from the way Codex advocates the implementation of the risk analysis paradigm. I mean, the risk analysis paradigm is summarized by risk assessment, risk management, risk communication, but I will come to this later. A lot of what I mentioned is included in that notion of risk communication. Risk communication is not only communicating the risk in the simplistic way, but mostly interacting with the stakeholder community and sharing the information in order to come up with the decisions in a essentially consensus-based and mostly really with the contribution and collaboration of everybody. Another element to consider is that risk management decisions, for the most part, are not static. And actually, this has never been, you know, more true than today, with changes of information and scientific and technological innovations coming out that actually influence the decisions that we made. Whenever you reach a decision and you implement a management approach, it is very important to set a time for the evaluation of the effectiveness of that approach, which generally lead you to identify new issue, which actually makes you redo that cycle again. Meaning, you identified a new issue, you conduct another assessment, you identify potential management options, and so on. So it is very important to consider any type of a decision in the context of a life cycle approach of that decision. Now, again, really advocating for the risk analysis principles. Why do we have to check ourselves as regulators? And I'm sorry, I'm still saying we, even though I left that community, but I guess, you know, once a regulator, always a regulator. You kind of almost keep that paradigm in mind. Why do we need to check ourselves that we are adhering to the risk analysis principles? Well, this is what provides you consistency of decisions. This is what provides you the fact that decisions are independent of the individual. This is also what therefore creates trust amongst the various players. And actually trust leads to cooperation. Without trust, you do not have partnerships and collaborations. Now, of course, if we need to have the stick element, of why we need to adhere to this, because most countries that have signed the WTO agreements, that are member of the World Trade Organization, they have to adhere to the SPS and TBT agreement. And in the SPS agreement, it is clearly referenced that the risk analysis paradigm has to be followed if sanitary measures have to be developed or adopted. And again, risk analysis principles, as a result, become so important in the context where you have food being traded and traded even more amongst countries. So essentially, it supports that international trade. It also provides a framework for regulators, hopefully, to adapt to changes, and particularly changes resulting from food innovation, particularly in the context, for example, of novel foods and functional foods. Now, a few words about the trends that challenge regulators and that we're seeing today. I'm going to almost actually repeat what was mentioned by the subsecretary earlier. I mean, these are trends that are witnessed not only in Argentina, but they are witnessed elsewhere. Just going to emphasize on a couple of elements, and perhaps actually focusing on the consumer element. We used to think that consumers are those obedient beings. We tell them essentially what to eat, what to consume, and they will follow. I mean, they never were like that, but they are even less now than they were before. Why? Because essentially sources of information are so diverse. With globalization, they do not actually wait for the regulator to mention something in order for them to get the information. The internet is so full of information, and information is driving and is moving so quickly. So they're not actually that easy beings as they used to be. The other element is that the trends are changing so quickly. I mean, we're hearing about a number of trends. So, well, don't eat processed foods, don't, eat local food, eat gluten-free food, eat this, don't eat that. So a number of these trends are also, changing, and of course they are impacting the way foods are being produced, the foods are being consumed. And of course, I mean, this is something that we've seen since the 80s and the 90s and continues to happen, which is the increased diversity and the reduced seasonability of foods. You can find foods from everywhere, practically on every market at this point. I mean, as was mentioned earlier, fresh fruits and vegetables in Canada, were essentially more limited. Now you can find all sorts of fruits and vegetables all year long from every part of the country at actually reasonable costs. And that's also the important element. It's the fact that these are now affordable. Now, speaking about an illustration about the change in the way consumers and regulators interact, I'm going to use the example of food fortification. As regulators, you used to think, and actually sometimes you may still want to think, that you are the one deciding, particularly animated by a public health, direction, you are deciding what is the vehicle that you would like to impose on consumers to have fortification, for example. And that can be the case in some instances where there is a clearly justified public health paradigm. The example that I'm going to give is, in Canada, we have a deficiency of an important subset of the population in folic acid intake. So a decision was made in the late 80s to fortify flour with folic acid. And of course, a risk assessment was conducted identifying that the rest of the population will not be suffering from this fortification element. And regulators decided for a mandatory fortification of folic acid, of flour with folic acid. A second example, and in this particular case it's more discretionary, it's to identify that, well, vitamin D, which is also another nutrient where there is a deficiency in a subset of the population, particularly actually in women and women over 50 right now. So there was a decision made to fortify certain foods, including milk, with vitamin D. In fact, the fortification of milk is a mandatory one in Canada for milk. The fortification of calcium in orange juice is actually more of a discretionary one, but still authorized and decided upon by regulators. Well, what do we see now? We see that consumers are actually willing now to choose which vehicle they would want to have for a fortification of a particular nutrient. That changes the paradigm for regulators. I mean, I'm not speaking here about, public health-driven fortification where a big subset of the population is lacking something, but I'm speaking here about some subsets of the population wanting to address their need, their nutritional need. Of course, you can question whether they are informed well or not, and these are other considerations in the risk management, but they want to have that choice. And that, of course, drives a number of changes in the consumption of food. So consumers are an important element in those decisions. Of course, this is happening in an environment where we're seeing a number of public health challenges. We know that food and nutrition have a contribution to public health beyond what we define traditionally by foodborne illnesses, and of course, whatever we attribute to bugs and chemicals, to pathogens and chemicals in food. We know that also the increasing rates of obesity continue essentially to alarm us all as risk managers and public health officials. And there's also a trend of identifying a public enemy. And that trend tends to change from time to time. In the 70s and the 80s, the public enemy was fat. Then we moved to salt, and now we are with sugar. And there will be probably others, public enemies. I'm not essentially judging what's happening. This is really what's happening right now. Now, of course, this is happening while regulators, again, living through all this, are still exercising their mandate, which is essentially to regulate food. And they are doing this in the mix of these changes, and still in a context where we have to consider, and that was mentioned for Argentina earlier, but it is still the same for a number of countries, food and food production continue to be an engine of economic growth and economic development. Okay? In a lot of countries, food production tends to be the first industrial sector, and now actually having the opportunity to serve with UNIDO, that's why UNIDO is investing so much money in development of the food industry sector, because usually that's the sector immediately after the primary production, and that tends to be an engine of development as well, not only economic, but also human development. And again, going back to the fact that regulators continue to struggle within this, this context, particularly with food innovation, and I gave a couple of illustrations here. The way fortification is being managed, the way health claims are being managed, very inconsistent frameworks, creating actually quite a bit of confusion in some instances. And I would argue also here our international organizations, such as the Codex Alimentarius Commission, did not pay enough attention to guidance on how food standards could actually be developed in order to help innovation in the food sector. We are still actually focusing on somewhat older problems in food safety and nutrition. Now, when you look at, when you ask people about what they think about regulators, you have practically two competing views, and I wanted to illustrate those because that's what I used to hear as a regulator. You have obviously one side of the coin that tells you that, well, you know what, regulators are completely out of pace of the reality. They don't live in the food production system right now. And actually, you know what, they are an impediment to innovation. They are actually even getting out of the intended rationale of regulations. They are somewhat paternalistic, bodies. That's first view. A second view is, well, you know what, you're not doing enough. Regulations are not fulfilling the public health objective. You should be making people eat the food that is good for them. You are letting unhealthy products on the market, and you are in bed with industry, and therefore you are not protecting people with the instrument that you were given, which is regulations. Now, of course, I used to think, and I mean, I would be interested in hearing what Pam thinks about this, that when regulators get actually criticism from both sides of the cone, that's when you consider that you're doing a good job. So, but maybe not to the extreme of these views. So essentially, not the question on who is right here, but I think what we need to discuss is how do we get out of these paradigms and rather look at the principles of the way a regulatory instrument should be applied by going back to these academic outlines that I just shared with you earlier. And that's what I'm going to attempt essentially to illustrate through some examples. And perhaps actually going back to almost the WTO definition of what essentially a regulatory instrument is. Regulating the composition of food, and even actually regulating the appearance of food as a result of a health issue is considered to be a sanitary measure. And again, here we do have guidance. So essentially, if we get lost as regulators, if regulators get lost, there is some guidance, particularly for countries that have signed the WTO agreement. Article 5 of the SPS agreement define when sanitary measures, when these measures are justified to be used as a regulatory instrument. You need to have a documented health risk. You need to have a documented health risk using techniques that were agreed upon by international organizations and international practices. These assessments need to be based on the best available scientific information. So a risk assessment is absolutely paramount before proceeding with any type of risk management decision, and that risk assessment needs to characterize the risk, needs to identify also the population that is potentially targeted by that risk, and even the level of uncertainties. The second element is how do you manage that risk? And there is guidance, because a risk management decision is not a scientific decision. A risk management decision is, in fact, an integrative decision, taking into account the outcome of science and overlaying a number of policy considerations, including economic considerations, social considerations, feasibility of the measures that are being contemplated. And again, there is guidance in that regard that these measures should take into account an objective of minimizing negative trade impacts, and definitely going back to those notions that I mentioned earlier, the fact that we need consistency, we need transparency, and therefore avoiding any type of arbitrary or unjustifiable decisions. I'm going to use this now to illustrate that with one example. And before doing so, just actually, I would like to position the regulatory measure in the context of the continuum of risk management. When you have a risk to manage, you have, in fact, a suite of instruments that are available to you as regulators or public health officials, because those need to work together, in fact, in tandem. And generally, you have obviously what you use in terms of regulations. Regulations, you have standards. So for example, setting maximum levels, not authorizing some foods that may be contaminated by certain something, requiring certain limits for nutrients in food, if again, that is justified by a risk assessment, requiring a certain label, a certain mention to appear on the label, such as, for example, nutrition facts table, you know, the labeling of nutrients. Again, those nutrients were not chosen arbitrarily. There was an assessment that was conducted to identify why these were important. But again, that's not enough. You need to couple that with a number of other elements, a lot of risk communication. And again, I really put this, while actually I would like to insist that this is not the most effective way, because putting things on the web and putting advisories, that's not the best way to reach consumers. You need to find the right mechanism for the information to reach those who need to use it. And sometimes you need to use what I call relay mechanisms, such as consumer organization, patient groups, and so on. So the non-regulatory measures are equally important in the context of managing the risk for a population. And that's essentially, what I would like to illustrate in the context of trans fatty acids. Now, managing health risks, again, here I'm illustrating the fact that it is a toolbox of measures that need to be applied. Now, moving to TFAs, trans fatty acids. You probably know this issue. Canada actually was a country that had amongst the highest intake of trans fatty acids. Definition of these are fatty acids that were in fact industrially produced. Trans fatty acids exist naturally, but at low amounts, mostly in ruminant fat. But trans fatty acids were, between brackets, invented more along the line when saturated fats were the public enemy number one. And we wanted to change, or we find alternatives to saturated fats. We wanted to find alternatives that were stable and that actually, for example, withstood transportation durations, and also withstood high temperature of treatment. So that's essentially what we were looking for. Like food scientists and technologists were looking for these particular options. Now, the problem is that at the time, we did not know the potential health impacts of these trans fatty acids. I mean, we found solutions in finding those replacement options, essentially by partially hydrogenizing some naturally occurring fats, and we found some fats that were stable, hard, they can withstand high temperatures and so on. Now, examining the health impacts of those, which started towards the late 80s, early 90s, we found that they were essentially what I call the double whammy effect. Saturated fats had a problem by increasing your bad cholesterol. This actually had not only the effect of increasing the bad cholesterol, but actually it reduced the good cholesterol as well. So essentially, it's a double negative health impact. And Canadians had amongst the highest intake of trans fatty acids in the world. Why is that? Again, production in the north, you wanted to have, things that traveled long distances. We don't have access a lot to palm oil, I would say. So essentially, we tried to find solutions that were coming from oils, from oil seeds that were produced locally. And there was a huge investment in the production of trans fatty acids. And this was not only a Canadian element, it was also a United States element. But in Canada, we were amongst actually the highest consumers. This shows you a picture of the intake of trans fatty acids. There's actually an estimate that was made in 1995, 8.7 grams of trans fat intake that was coming essentially from trans fat. This is amongst the high. In fact, actually, we were higher than the United States in that regard. By the way, this in and by itself justifies a potential look for solutions for Canadian situations, for a particular country, because the rest of the countries, even if that decision is different from other countries, because we could have, a public health situation that is specific to one particular jurisdiction. So what was done? Of course, I'm going to fast track what happened between the 1990s until today. Well, clearly, there was a demonstration that trans fatty acids were leading to an unacceptable health risk. This was clearly demonstrated with a number of risk assessments, the latest of which was published, in fact, in this particular paper that was made available in 2013. We know as well that trans fats were, to a certain extent, discretionarily used. So essentially, they were invented by industry, but there could be potential replacement for them. Not as many at the time, but there was a strong emphasis made when this issue was discovered from a public health and risk consideration standpoint to invest on replacement options. And those replacement options were found to be, to a certain extent, cost effective and viable, so that you can produce them and they are economically viable. what were the actions that were identified by the regulator at the time? Well, the first thing is to alert consumers to the fact that trans fat are present in their food and the amount that is there. And of course, this is coupled with information about the health impacts. Canada was, in fact, the first country in the world to include trans fat in the nutrition facts labels. And essentially, Canadians were able to see for every food how much of trans fat they were potentially consuming. And of course, this was coupled with information about the potential bad effects of trans fat. Just doing this was enough to help decrease the amounts in a, what I call voluntary way by industry, because again, if consumers are aware, they will change, hopefully, their habits. That was the speculation on the part of the regulator, but we'll see if essentially that indeed worked. There was a consideration of looking at regulating this. And there were levels that were established to lead to a safe consumption and to a reduction of the overall population intake of trans fat. The reduction essentially could be achieved by setting a maximum level of 2% of TFA in fats that are used in margarines and spreads and so on. So essentially putting a maximum in those particular products and putting an overall maximum as a proportion of fats in other foods. The idea behind this is, rather than essentially banning a product, because again, a trans fatty acid produced industrially is considered to be an ingredient. You don't need to have an authorization to produce that. The way this approach was found was essentially you achieve your public health goal, your risk assessment objective of reducing the intake is achieved through these levels. This was conducted through modeling, while you leave discretion to industry essentially to manage that according to their product formulation. It has an element of achievability, as opposed to coming at a certain point and saying, thou shall ban the use of a particular product. With this, you achieve still your public health goal. And as I mentioned, there was an identification of viable and cost-effective replacement options for trans fat. Now, let's look at the impacts of the labeling option alone. This is essentially a representation of the change in certain products of the level of TFA in certain foods in 1995 and in 2005. Just the labeling instrument was implemented. That in and by itself resulted in a dramatic reduction in trans fat in food, just through that labeling provision. Now, of course, that did not work alone. You needed to have a risk communication measure there. You needed to work with manufacturers in order to ensure that there were replacement options. And frankly, here, there was a contribution on the part of regulators in order to encourage the approval of alternatives. A lot of alternatives to trans fats were, in fact, genetically modified oil seeds that had essentially a fatty acid profile that was quite suitable, helping us achieve that public health goal, but that needed approval because they are considered to be novel foods. And the regulator fast-tracked the approval of this, and that's what helped contribute to the availability of these alternative measures. Now, you would ask me, well, then you have achieved the goal, and do you need still to regulate? And this was an assessment that was conducted in 2013, and at the time, the conclusion was, yes, you do. On the basis of what? And this is the type of the assessment that was conducted. The 2013 risk assessment that I mentioned was conducted after the evaluation of the impact of the labeling requirements. It found that Canadians' intake in trans fatty acids has been reduced dramatically. It was getting close, but not being enough to reaching the WHO guideline, which is essentially to have less than 1% of energy coming from trans fatty acids, because that was the goal that we wanted to achieve. There was definitely a recognition that most of the industry sector moved towards replacing trans fat, and that was evident through testing, through labeling. But there was the identification of a number of imported products that had a high level of trans fat. So in fact, we've identified that the field was not, the level playing field was not created between domestic products and imported products. And yes, I'm getting close to the end, actually. The other element that was conducted here was the assessment of the instrument of choice situation there. If we applied regulation and if we limited trans fat by regulation to the levels that I mentioned earlier, what would be the impact? And here there was an impact identified to look essentially that we would have a net, oh my gosh, I'm going too quick here, sorry. See, that's what happens when you are beyond time and you're trying to rush. A net benefit of health to between $5 to $9 billion and a cost estimated at around $200 million. This was enough of a justification that from an economic standpoint, you could potentially implement an additional regulatory instrument. This was not implemented till this day. Now, I would like, given that we don't have enough time here, I'm just going to finish by a couple of recommendations or elements to think about in the context of applying the regulatory instrument. That decisions have to be based on careful and documented risk assessments. That time is being spent on the analysis of the instrument of choice, that a regulation is indeed the right instrument to use. Labeling is not a magic wand that you can use for anything and everything, and frankly, labeling in food needs to be better codified even at the international level. Just remember that for a food that contains a food allergen, we don't put may kill an allergic consumer. We just may contain something. So there are rules of when labeling should be used and how it should be used. And the other element that I would like to mention is that regulatory instruments are there to manage products when the risk is identified, when the product has an issue. If, when you conduct your risk assessment, you identify that the risk is coming a lot from consumption behaviors or from diets, you know that the regulatory instrument is not there to regulate people. Consumers cannot be regulated in order to address a particular risk. One last message, if I may, is the importance of the risk communication element, a reminder of the definition of codex, that it is not the mere communication of the health risk, that it is more the partnership and the collaboration amongst the various partners, and this is what is key in order to make any type of risk management decision work. Again, the importance also of benchmarking your decisions with international considerations, just challenging yourself that whatever you proposed is actually tried or has been potentially tried by other jurisdictions, and a reminder that none of your decisions should be static, but you need to go back and actually review those in a life cycle approach. That's essentially what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Sorry that I went a little bit over time, and again, happy to discuss later on.